Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of M&A's most intriguing and often, let's face it, contentious mechanisms, the earnout clause.
Right.
It's something that, on paper, it promises this perfect win-win situation. But then, in practice, well, it frequently becomes a source of pretty intense post-acquisition disputes. So, what exactly is this mechanism designed to do, and why does it so often lead to conflict?
It's a fascinating area, really. Imagine you're in the middle of a high-stakes negotiation.
Okay.
Okay. On one side, you have a seller, someone who's poured their life, their energy into building a company. They're absolutely convinced it's on the cusp of, exponential growth.
Right. They see the moonshot potential.
Exactly. They envision a sky-high valuation, a price that truly reflects those optimistic future projections. But then on the other side, you have the buyer. They certainly see the potential, sure, but they also keenly understand the inherent risks, the uncertainties of that, well, unproven future.
They're more grounded in the now.
They are. They're willing to pay a fair price for the current value, but they're understandably hesitant to fully commit upfront to the seller's, let's say, highly optimistic future valuation.
And that's the core challenge, isn't it? Bridging that chasm when future value is just so difficult to predict. Without some kind of creative solution, a lot of promising deals would just, well, stall or fall apart right there.
Precisely. And this is exactly where earnout clauses become so crucial in M&A deals. We're talking about a portion of the purchase price that isn't paid immediately at closing.
Deferred payment.
Deferred payment, exactly. It becomes contingent on the acquired company actually hitting specific performance targets after the deal closes. The idea, really, it's brilliant in its simplicity. It allows buyers to pay less upfront for that uncertain future value, mitigating their risk.
Well, sellers can still get a higher total price if their big growth predictions actually come true.
Right. It allows sellers to realize that higher total price. It truly sounds like a perfect win-win, a way to align interests and share that future upside.
It does sound like a silver bullet for those valuation disagreements. But here's where it gets, well, really interesting and often quite complicated. Despite their apparent elegance, earnout clauses are actually a major source of post-acquisition disputes. Why is that? If it's supposed to be a win-win, where's the conflict actually coming from?
Well, the conflict arises from a fundamental shift. A shift in control and, crucially, in incentives. Once a deal closes, the buyer is now the one managing the company.
They're in the driver's seat.
They are. And subtly, perhaps, their incentives can change. If the target company performs well enough to actually trigger the earnout payment, well, the buyer has to pay more money.
Right. An extra check to write.
So suddenly, the buyer might have incentives, perhaps even unconsciously, to not hit those very targets they agreed upon, simply to avoid paying that additional consideration. And the seller, naturally, who's patiently waiting for their deferred payout, very understandably begins to suspect bad faith, or even outright obstruction if those targets aren't met. It's a tension that's kind of baked into the very structure.
So our mission today is to take a deep dive into these legal complexities. We're going to unpack why earnouts are so critical in modern M&A, what kinds of disputes typically arise between buyers and sellers, and maybe most importantly, how you can structure these provisions to minimize conflicts and, maximize the chances of a smoother outcome.
Yeah, getting the drafting right is key.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at this from both a Korean legal perspective, specifically looking at Civil Code Article 150, and comparing it with, well, the very well-established Delaware case law. Our goal is really to provide actionable insights for you, whether you're a business professional, a corporate lawyer, or a deal maker working on a Korean domestic deal, or, increasingly common, a cross-border transaction. Let's get into it.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's first unpack this core idea. Why earnouts are so vital for bridging these valuation gaps. I mean, determining the true fair price for a company, especially one that's unlisted or privately held or operating in a really rapidly evolving market, it's incredibly difficult, right?
Oh, absolutely. Its value isn't static. It's a living, breathing entity. Its worth is constantly fluctuating based on, well, everything market trends, competitive shifts, tech advancements, its own future performance.
So much uncertainty.
Exactly. And in M&A, you often find this significant valuation gap. On one side, you've got the seller, maybe the founder, who's poured their life into this. They see immense potential, maybe astronomical future growth. Perhaps they just launched a groundbreaking product, or they're on the verge of a major market expansion. Naturally, they want that future value reflected in today's sale price.
They want credit for the future today.
Pretty much. Meanwhile, the buyer, while recognizing that potential, also sees the inherent risks, the unknowns of the future. They're looking at their own business plans, their synergy projections, and often their valuation just doesn't line up with the seller's aspirational figures.
So the seller wants a premium for tomorrow's promise, and the buyer wants a discount for today's risk. Classic standoff.
It is. It's a classic deal-breaker scenario. Without some mechanism to bridge that gap, many promising transactions would simply collapse, leaving both parties frustrated. And this is where earnouts, ride in like the cavalry.
Okay.
They directly address this by deferring a portion of the purchase price, making it contingent on the target company's future performance.
Right. It allows buyers to pay less upfront for that uncertain future value, cutting their immediate risk.
And sellers can still realize a much higher total price if their optimistic growth projections actually come true. It's a sophisticated way of saying, okay, let's get on the future together and share the rewards if that bet pays off.
That makes sense. But it's important to distinguish earnouts from other price adjustment mechanisms you hear about, right? Like completion accounts or locked box. They sound similar, but are actually quite different.
That's a crucial distinction, yes. Many professionals are familiar with completion accounts. Think of those like a final audit adjustment almost. After the deal closes, you look at the company's balance sheet at a specific future date, usually the closing date itself, and adjust the purchase price up or down based on agreed targets for things like, say, working capital or net debt.
Making sure the balance sheet is what you thought it was at closing.
Exactly. The goal is to ensure the buyer receives the company with the expected level of liquidity or debt that was agreed upon. Then you have the locked box mechanism.
Right, the lockbox. How does that work again?
Lockbox is more like agreeing on a fixed price based on a historical balance sheet, a lockbox date, which is usually several months before closing. The idea is the buyer is effectively buying the company as it stood on that historical date.
Frozen in time, almost.
In a way, yes. And from that date until closing, any value that leaks out of the company, like dividends paid to the seller or unusual payments not in the ordinary course, has to be accounted for and usually gets deducted from the purchase price.
Okay, so both of those, completion accounts and lockbox, they're really about adjusting the price based on historical or closing date financials, making sure the snapshot you agreed on is accurate.
Precisely. They're largely about accounting for past or current financial snapshots, making sure the numbers you based your initial offer on are actually what you're getting when you take control. Earnouts, however, are fundamentally different.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, earnouts aren't just about tweaking the price based on balance sheet movements or historical figures. They're about sharing the future upside, or downside even. They represent the true dynamic price adjustment based on future performance, not just past accounting. That seems like a critical distinction.
Absolutely. It's about aligning incentives for future value creation. And these aren't just theoretical constructs, stuck in textbooks. Earnout clauses are incredibly prevalent in practice, both in Korean domestic M&A deals and globally. We've seen some very high-profile examples right here in Korea that really illustrate how significant these clauses can be.
Yeah, I remember the Samsung Hanwha big deal back in 2014. That was a massive transaction, huge news. And it famously included an earnout clause, didn't it? With a potential, what was it, 100 billion KRW additional payment.
100 billion KRW, yes. A huge sum riding on future performance. It really demonstrates the potential impact, the scale these things can reach.
And it's not just for the massive conglomerates either, right?
Not at all. Think about Krafton's acquisition of the US game developer Unknown Worlds in 2021. That deal, really critical for Krafton's global expansion strategy, had a potential additional payment of up to $250 million tied to an earnout.
Wow, $250 million. That's serious money.
It is. Or even more recently, Kakao Pay's acquisition of payment in 2024 that also featured an earnout provision. So you see them across the board. These aren't obscure niche clauses. They're mainstream, versatile tools for navigating complex valuations across diverse industries, heavy industry, gaming, fintech, you name it. They really reflect the increasing uncertainty in valuing fast-growing, innovative companies.
Okay, so they're common and important. Let's dissect the anatomy of an actual earnout clause then. To really understand them, you need to break down their core components because, as you said, each one is like a mini negotiation shaping whether this thing works or blows up later.
Exactly. First, and maybe most obviously, are the specific conditions for payment. What precisely needs to happen for that deferred money to actually be released? Is it hitting a certain revenue target, a profit margin? Or maybe it's a non-financial milestone, like getting a specific patent approved, or closing a critical strategic partnership.
And that leads directly to the question of who's actually holding the reins during this period, right? Who's steering the ship?
Absolutely. That's the second critical element, how the target company will be managed during the earnout period. Will the seller's founding team stay on and run the show, maybe with some oversight from the buyer? Or will the buyer fully integrate the acquired company, putting their own management in charge from day one?
And that choice dramatically impacts who has direct control over achieving those earnout conditions.
It does. It determines who's driving the car during this crucial earnout journey, and thus where the risks and incentives really lie. And flowing directly from that are the obligations imposed on both the buyer and the seller.
Right, the rules of the road.
Exactly. If the buyer is running the company, what specific duties do they owe the seller to ensure a fair shot at the earnout? This is where we often see those effort obligations come into play, things like requiring the buyer to use commercially reasonable efforts to hit the targets.
And conversely, if the seller is still managing.
Then the focus shifts.
Yeah.
What obligations do they have to avoid, say, artificially inflating performance or taking crazy risks just to try the payout? It's all about setting clear rules of engagement and accountability for both sides.
Then you have the more practical considerations, like the duration and payment schedule of the earnout. How long does this period last? 1 year, 3 years, 5?
And will the payment be a single lump sum at the very end? Or will it be spread out, maybe in proportional installments, as certain targets are hit along the way? This has significant cash flow implications for both sides, obviously.
Yeah, that's another area ripe for negotiation, balancing that immediate certainty versus long-term potential.
And finally, the payment structure itself. Is it that single lump sum or proportional installments? A lump sum offers potentially a big payout, but it defers all the risk to the very end of the earnout period.
While installments might offer earlier cash flow for the seller and spread out the buyer's payment obligation.
Right, but they also mean more frequent measurements, potentially more opportunities for minor disputes, and often just more administrative overhead tracking everything. Each choice has its own set of trade-offs to consider.
Let's dive deeper into those earnout payment conditions because, like you said, this is where the rubber really meets the road. These conditions can be incredibly diverse, custom designed to resolve that initial valuation disagreement.
They can. They can be very specific, non-financial events, like maybe obtaining a new regulatory license that unlocks a market, or closing a particularly major strategic deal with a key customer, or even winning a significant lawsuit that removes a huge contingent liability.
Things that clearly create value, but aren't just about the P&L.
Exactly. Or, as is more common and often, frankly, more contentious, they can be much more comprehensive, often tied to financial metrics.
And financial metrics, I imagine, are the most common and probably the most disputed type of condition.
Without a doubt. From a seller's perspective, they typically prefer revenue as the metric. Why? Because it's generally seen as less susceptible to, let's say, arbitrary cost adjustments or managerial discretion by the buyer post-closing.
It's a top-line number, harder to manipulate maybe. Reflects market acceptance.
That's the thinking. But if you're the buyer, you're usually much more interested in true profitability, right? You want to know that the company isn't just generating sales, but actually generating profit after all the expenses.
Makes sense. So buyers typically prefer profit-based metrics like earnings or net income because that reflects the actual bottom line.
Right, and this is where the negotiation really heats up. As sellers worry about profit manipulation, maybe the buyer loads up costs, and buyers worry about sellers pushing for inflated revenue targets that don't actually translate to profit.
So what's the common middle ground?
That's precisely why you often see a compromise emerge. The use of EBITDA earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It's a widely accepted proxy for operational profitability. It strips out financing decisions, tax structures, non-cash accounting items like depreciation.
Trying to get to the core operating cash flow.
Exactly. It's generally seen as a good indicator of that.
Yeah.
But even EBITDA isn't totally immune to manipulation, which brings us to the nuance of normalized EBITDA.
Normalization. This is where you try to strip out any one-time or non-recurring expenses or income, right? To get a clearer picture of the core operational profitability.
That's the goal. For instance, if the acquired company had a massive one-off legal settlement that skewed its profits during the earnout period, or maybe they closed down a non-performing division, incurring significant write-offs, you'd want to normalize that out.
To get rid of the noise, essentially.
Get rid of the noise, yes.
Yeah.
Get a truer picture of the ongoing operational performance. But here's the catch. The specific items to be normalized are themselves critical negotiation points. What one party sees as a one-time expense, the other might argue, is actually a recurring cost of doing business. It's fertile ground for dispute if you're not careful.
Which brings us back to specificity. It sounds like while specificity doesn't eliminate all disputes, it absolutely minimizes them and provides clearer boundaries.
Absolutely. Let's consider a scenario. Imagine an earnout is based purely on earning, okay? And the buyer, after acquiring the company, incurs a large, what they claim is a one-time consulting fee. Let's say 500 million KRW during the earnout period.
Right.
And maybe coincidentally, maybe not, this causes the earning figure to fall just short of the earnout target, say by 400 million KRW.
Oh boy, I can see exactly where this is going. The buyer says, look, it was a necessary business expense, integration costs, synergy planning, totally unavoidable.
Right. While the seller, on the other side, is thinking, hold on a minute, this looks an awful lot like intentional obstruction. You just happen to spend a huge sum that conveniently dropped the earnings right below my target, saving you a big payout.
Classic dispute scenario. Buyer claims legitimate business purpose, seller suspects a deliberate act to avoid payment.
Exactly. But now, imagine if the earnout clause had explicitly stated something like, one-time integration expenses below 200 million KRW will be included, but any such expenses exceeding that amount will be excluded from the earning calculation.
Then that specific argument goes away.
It might have avoided that specific dispute entirely. It highlights how precise drafting of financial metrics isn't just, good legal practice. It's absolutely crucial for preventing future conflicts and managing expectations. It ensures both sides are playing by the same clearly defined rules before the game even starts.
So we've broken down what earnouts are and how meticulously they need to be drafted to even get off the ground, aiming for that perfect alignment of interests. But here's the paradox. Despite their theoretical elegance, earnouts inherently create this fascinating and often frustrating battleground. Because once the ink dries and the buyer takes control, their incentives, particularly around hitting those earnout targets, can shift dramatically. This is where the buyer's post-acquisition dilemma really comes into play.
It creates a really peculiar shift in incentives, yeah. And it's important for deal makers on both sides to understand this dynamic from the buyer's perspective. We can almost conceptualize the target company's performance during the earnout period into three distinct sections from the buyer's viewpoint.
Okay, what are these sections?
First, you have the earnout condition under fulfillment section. In this zone, the company is performing below the earnout threshold. Here, the buyer genuinely wants to maximize performance to reach that threshold. Why?
Because it makes their new asset more valuable.
Exactly. Increased performance directly benefits the value of their newly acquired asset, regardless of the earnout itself. It's still in their best interest to grow the company and integrate it successfully.
Okay, so they're pushing hard to get to that initial hurdle, trying to realize the full potential of the acquisition. Makes sense. But then comes the tricky part, the earn-out section. This sounds like where the alignment really breaks down.
Precisely. This is the critical zone, maybe a narrow band, where achieving the earn-out condition means the buyer has to pay that additional consideration. In this particular zone, the buyer suddenly has a powerful, often unspoken incentive to maintain performance just below that threshold.
Why pay more if they don't absolutely have to?
That's the thinking, especially if the marginal benefit of crossing that line, say, an extra million in revenue, is less than the actual earnout payment itself, which could be tens of millions.
Yeah.
It's a direct hit to their bottom line for maybe only a proportional increase in the acquired asset's value, creating a real disincentive to push that final mile.
Wow, that sounds like a minefield. And then there's the third section you mentioned, the earnout condition over fulfillment section.
Yes, and this is actually the ideal scenario for the buyer, maybe counterintuitively. If the target company's performance vastly exceeds the earnout payment threshold, really knocks it out of the park, then the increase in the intrinsic value of the acquired shares significantly outweighs the earnout payment.
So they're happy to pay because the asset is performing so well.
Absolutely. In this case, the buyer is perfectly happy to write that earnout check because the asset they've acquired is performing exceptionally well, far beyond expectations. It's a big win for them, a clear success for their acquisition strategy.
So it's really that middle earnout section where all the potential for conflict lives. If I'm a buyer and I see the company performing right in that zone, that precise spot where meeting the target means paying more, the temptation to maybe slow things down or shift priorities or allocate resources differently, it must be immense.
It is. It sounds like a constant ethical tightrope walk for the buyer's management. This creates what we often call a moral hazard, or maybe more accurately, a conflict of interest, the buyer.
Right. How does that conflict play out practically?
Well, consider this very real scenario.
Mm.
If the buyer's own employee, say a VP from the acquiring company, also holds a position on the target company's board or management team post-acquisition, their fiduciary duty to the target company is technically to maximize its profit and performance.
But their loyalty and duty to their employer, the buyer?
Might be to minimize the earnout payment. This internal conflict is incredibly challenging to navigate, and it inevitably leads to intense seller suspicion if those earnout conditions aren't met. Sellers will, quite naturally, start scrutinizing whether the buyer intentionally interfered, especially when they see performance hovering just below that payout line.
It makes perfect sense that sellers would try to protect themselves from this inherent conflict then. What kind of measures do they typically demand in the acquisition agreement to try and mitigate the buyer's potential for interference?
Sellers often push for very specific protective measures, especially when they're ceding management control. Common demands include requiring the buyer to get the seller's prior consent for specific management decisions during the earnout period.
Like what kind of decisions?
Things like major capital expenditures, significant layoffs, big changes in product strategy, maybe entering or exiting certain lines of business. This gives the seller a sort of veto power over certain strategic moves that could negatively impact the earnout potential.
Okay, what else?
They might also insist the buyer continues the target company's ordinary course of business, as it was prior to acquisition. The idea is to ensure no radical changes in operations or resource allocation that could harm earnout performance. And maybe most importantly, sellers often demand specific effort obligations from the buyer.
Requiring them to actively work towards hitting the targets, not just passively manage.
Exactly. Rather than just avoiding bad faith, actively trying to achieve the goal.
I can see why sellers would want those protections. But what about the less common scenario, where the seller actually continues to manage the target company during the earnout period? Does the dynamic just flip? Do the concerns shift entirely to the buyer?
It absolutely does flip.
Yeah.
In those cases, the buyer's concerns become paramount. The seller, still in control, might then be incentivized to, say, artificially inflate performance in the short term.
Or worse?
Or worse, engage in risky behavior, maybe even push legal boundaries, just to hit those targets and secure their payout, potentially without regard for the company's long-term health or sustainability.
So buyers would want their own protections then?
Absolutely. Buyers in that situation would seek strong consent rights over major decisions, maybe demand board representation to monitor operations closely, or even negotiate termination rights if the seller's management appears to be acting against the company's long-term interests or engaging in reckless behavior. It's a symmetrical risk, really.
This highlights that managerial discretion is just a constant factor, regardless of who is technically managing. Even if an earnout is based purely on a simple revenue target, a manager still has discretion over, say, revenue recognition timing, or which projects get prioritized, or where sales resources are allocated. It's not just about what they do, but when and how they do it.
Precisely. Let's take another common and often frustrating scenario for sellers. A buyer, now managing the acquired company, identifies a lucrative multi-year contract that could potentially be signed right before the earnout period ends. However, they strategically postpone signing it.
Or maybe just slow walk the final negotiations.
Right. Or delay key steps in the sales process, effectively shifting the revenue recognition to a period after the earnout ends. This causes the company to just narrowly miss the earnout target.
And the buyer can just claim, oh, there were perfectly reasonable business reasons for the delay. We were negotiating better long-term terms, or waiting for market conditions to stabilize, or optimizing for our fiscal year-end reporting, which is now the company's reporting schedule.
Exactly. Without very specific contractual obligations spelling things out, the seller faces an immense uphill battle trying to prove intentional obstruction. It's almost impossible to definitively prove that, but for that delay, the target would have been hit, because the buyer nearly always has a plausible, legitimate-sounding business rationale.
Which is exactly why the need for contractually specified obligations is so critical, isn't it? General good faith might just not be enough on its own to police these kinds of subtle maneuvers.
You need more. You need clauses that explicitly state things, like maintain ordinary course of business, Or even more directly, those effort obligations we talked about, requiring active work towards the earnout.
And these effort obligations, they come in various flavors, right? I've seen terms like best effort, commercially reasonable effort, good faith effort.
Yes, and their interpretation can vary widely, depending on the jurisdiction, the specific wording used, and the context of the deal. Some contracts even try to set a clear negative boundary by explicitly stating no bad faith actions or omissions.
It's interesting because some contracts even go the other way and explicitly grant the buyer full discretion to operate the company, effectively trying to disclaim any obligation to maximize the earnout and maybe even override implied covenants of good faith.
That happens too. While that certainly sets a very clear boundary, it heavily tips the scales towards the buyer and significantly raises the risk for the seller. It makes that earnout less of a shared upside and more of a very difficult hurdle to clear.
Absolutely. This whole discussion just naturally leads us into the core legal interpretations. How do courts actually view bad faith? How are effort obligations treated in different key jurisdictions? This is really where the legal theory meets the practical realities of deal making.
And where the nuances of contract drafting truly earn their keep. Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into the legal frameworks, starting right here with Korea. Our first stop is Korean Civil Code Article 150. This seems to really lay the groundwork for understanding bad faith in earnout disputes within a specific statutory context.
Yes, Civil Code Article 150 is quite specific and potentially powerful. It stipulates that if a party who would be disadvantaged by a condition's fulfillment, think the buyer who'd have to pay the earnout acts in bad faith to prevent that condition from being met, then the law says the condition is deemed fulfilled.
So the law basically says, okay, you acted badly to stop it, so we'll treat it as if it happened anyway, forces the payment.
Exactly. And conversely, if a party who stands to benefit, maybe a seller managing post-closing acts in bad faith to cause a condition's fulfillment, it's deemed unfulfilled. The crucial threshold here, as you can imagine, is proving bad faith. In Korean, that's hyung, shini sang shil, which translates literally to sincerity and good faith, but legally implies a broader standard of fair dealing and acting trustworthily.
So how does the Korean Supreme Court actually interpret this bad faith? It can't just be a general feeling of unfairness, right? How do they define it in practical legal terms?
That's correct. It needs more structure. The Supreme Court defines the general principle of good faith, which is found in Civil Code Article 2, as an abstract norm. It requires parties to act fairly, to consider the other party's legitimate interests, and importantly, not to abuse their rights or breach the trust inherent in the relationship.
What factors do they look at when assessing this?
When assessing it, they consider things like the nature of the other party's interest, the relationship between the right or obligation and that interest, whether trust was reasonably given and relied upon, and maybe most importantly, if the action taken is objectively unacceptable based on common notions of justice and social order. It's a broad principle, allowing for flexibility in application depending on the facts.
Okay, and specifically for condition obstruction under Article 150, has the Supreme Court clarified what constitutes bad faith in that context?
They have. They've highlighted two key scenarios where bad faith in condition obstruction might be found. First, a failure to appropriately consider the other party's interests in unforeseen, maybe accidental, situations that weren't explicitly covered by the contract.
Yeah.
Essentially, taking unfair advantage of a loophole or an unexpected event.
Okay, and the second?
Second, taking a stance that's contradictory to prior actions or representations that the other party reasonably relied upon, leading to an outcome that feels unfair or unjust. To illustrate how difficult it can actually be to prove this, let's look at a couple of real cases.
Fantastic. Case studies always help make this concrete. What's the first one, the co-sale right case?
Okay, our first case is Supreme Court 2021 Day 223054. This involved a co-sale right, which is a pretty common provision in shareholder agreements allowing minority shareholders to sell alongside a majority shareholder.
Right, a tag-along right.
Exactly. The background was that some shareholders in this co-sale agreement tried to sell their shares to a third party, but another major shareholder withheld crucial confidential information from the potential buyers, which effectively prevented the sale from happening. The plaintiff shareholders argued this was bad faith obstruction under Article 150, claiming the condition for their co-sale right was deliberately hindered.
Okay, makes sense. And what was the court's ruling? Did they find bad faith obstruction there?
Interestingly, the Supreme Court did not find bad faith obstruction in this instance. Their reasoning really highlighted the inherent complexity and uncertainty of M&A deals, particularly in the very early stages. They noted that these transactions involve so many variables and uncertainties, especially at preliminary stages, like just submitting non-binding letters of intent, LOIs. The defendant shareholder in this case had a reasonable need, the court felt, to verify the sincerity of these potential buyers and, importantly, to protect highly confidential company information.
So just not handing over sensitive info early on wasn't automatically bad faith.
Right. The court found that simply not providing information at such an early non-binding stage, especially when the defendant had actually offered to meet the buyers directly to provide information, an offer the plaintiff refused was not an action contrary to good faith and justice that would justify deeming the sale condition fulfilled under Article 150.
So the big takeaway here for deal makers, especially sellers, is pretty critical. Even if an action prevents a condition from being met, it's not necessarily bad faith if there are reasonable, legitimate business reasons for that action. Things like protecting confidentiality, especially given the inherent uncertainties of M&A processes. It seems like it sets a very high bar for proving bad faith.
It does set a high bar. Now for our second Korean case study. Supreme Court 2020 Day 25343er. This was an intriguing director dismissal case. Here, a partnership agreement stated that if directors voluntarily resigned, they would transfer their shares back at par value. However, if they were involuntarily terminated, they would transfer a different, lower percentage of shares, less favorable for them.
Okay, different consequences for leaving versus being pushed out.
Exactly. The directors were later dismissed via a shareholder vote. The CEO, who was the plaintiff in this case seeking enforcement of the share transfer, was accused by the dismissed directors of acting in bad faith to cause their termination, thus personally benefiting from the more favorable share transfer terms triggered by the involuntary termination.
What was the court's decision in this one? Did they find that the CEO acted in bad faith to trigger that termination condition for personal gain?
Again, the court did not find bad faith. They reasoned first that the CEO's alleged personal benefit from the share transfer wasn't entirely clear. For example, there might have been restrictions on disposal or voting rights attached to those shares. But more importantly, the dismissal wasn't a unilateral act by the CEO.
It was a shareholder vote.
It was a collective decision made by the shareholders' meeting, which importantly included institutional investors. This suggested the decision was likely made for the company's perceived best interest, not just as a self-serving act by the CEO. The court emphasized that if a condition-triggering action has a rational justification related to the company's welfare, it is incredibly difficult to prove bad faith on the part of an individual who might also happen to benefit.
So this really reinforces the idea that an action is unlikely to be deemed bad faith if it's not solely for the party's personal benefit, if it's a result of a collective decision-making process, or if it has clear, legitimate business justifications. It's not just about the outcome, it's about the intent and the rationale behind the actions, which, again, makes it very challenging for sellers to successfully claim bad faith in these complex corporate situations.
It certainly does.
Okay, moving from Korea, let's turn our attention across the Pacific to Delaware. Its corporate law and really, its extensive body of case law holds significant influence, not just in the U.S., but globally, right? Including in Korea.
Oh, absolutely. It's often said, and the numbers bear it out, that more than half of NYSE-listed companies and something like 60% of Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware. So what happens in Delaware courts, especially the Court of Chancery, has ripple effects. It sets precedents that heavily influence M&A practices far beyond its borders. Understanding their approach to earnouts is pretty essential for any dealmaker, particularly in cross-border transactions.
So how does Delaware approach this idea of good faith, especially when it's not explicitly written into the contract?
In Delaware, the key concept is the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. It acts almost like a common-sense safety net, or what the courts often call a gap filler.
A gap filler. What does that mean practically?
It means it steps in for unforeseen situations where the contract itself is silent, where the parties didn't explicitly address a particular scenario. It ensures parties act consistently with the kind of common purpose of the contract and, crucially, the other party's justified expectations based on that purpose.
So it's not there to rewrite a bad deal for someone?
No, definitely not. It's there to prevent one party from undermining the very essence, the spirit of what was agreed upon, even if the contract doesn't spell out that specific prohibition. Think of it as preventing someone from deliberately frustrating the purpose of the agreement.
Okay. And this leads us to Delaware's generally quite restrictive view on applying this implied covenant, especially in the earnout context, right? As seen in the famous Winchell v. Viacom International Inc. case, it sounds like they're very cautious about using the safety net.
That's correct. Delaware courts generally take a very narrow contractarian view of the implied covenant when it comes to earnouts. They will not use it to impose obligations on the buyer to actively maximize earnout payments unless such an obligation is explicitly stated in the contract itself.
So, no implied duty to try your best to hit the target.
Generally, no. The court's stance is clear. They will not rewire a contract or create protections that the parties, sophisticated parties usually, fail to negotiate and include at the time of signing. The Winchell court famously said something like, if a plaintiff can prove the defendant acted in bad faith to prevent the earnout condition from being met, the implied covenant can provide a remedy, but it will not create a duty to maximize the earnout.
So, for any seller negotiating a deal governed by Delaware law, the critical insight from Winchell is stark. Don't walk into a deal expecting the courts to save you from a poorly negotiated earnout clause. If you want the buyer to actively work to maximize your payout, you must write that obligation into the contract explicitly. The implied covenant won't do it for you.
It's a powerful reminder that express terms really trump vague expectations in Delaware.
But there are instances where Delaware does find a violation of this implied covenant, aren't there? Like in American Capital Acquisition Partners, LLC v. LPL Holdings, Inc. That case seems to be the exception that really proves the rule.
Absolutely. American Capital provides a critical counterpoint. It illustrates the very narrow circumstances under which Delaware courts will intervene using the implied covenant.
Yeah.
In this scenario, a buyer acquired an investment management solution company. There was an earnout clause, but crucially, no specific effort obligation was written into the contract. The earnout wasn't met, and the seller sued, alleging bad faith.
Okay, so similar setup to Winchell in that there was no explicit effort clause. What made the court rule differently here? What was it about the buyer's actions that crossed the line?
The court did find a violation of the implied covenant of good faith here, and it was absolutely about the specific, undeniable actions taken by the buyer. The key distinction was that this wasn't merely a case of the buyer, say, failing to try hard enough to maximize the earnout. It wasn't about lack of effort.
What was it about then?
Instead, the evidence showed the buyer actively pivoted the target company's revenue stream to its own affiliate, effectively diverting business away from the entity whose performance measured the earnout. They also transferred key employees away from the target. And incredibly, there was evidence they instructed target employees to actively deter customers from doing business with the target during the earnout period.
Wow, that sounds pretty egregious. Those aren't just subtle operational changes. Those sound like direct, intentional acts to sabotage the earnout.
It was seen that way. These actions were considered not just a failure to maximize, but an active, deliberate series of acts intended to deprive the seller of the earnout. They were viewed as directly harmful to the target company's ability to perform, clearly against the seller's justified expectations based on the deal, and lacking any legitimate business purpose for the target company itself. The court essentially said, you can't deliberately starve the company you just bought simply to avoid paying the seller the agreed-upon earnout.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the Delaware principles then. A buyer generally has no implied duty to maximize an earnout or take extra steps beyond what's explicitly agreed in the contract. They won't be forced to go above and beyond.
Correct.
However, the buyer is strictly prohibited from taking actions with the specific purpose of actively preventing or minimizing the earnout payment, especially if those actions aren't legitimate business decisions for the acquired company or actively harm the target. That seems to be the crucial line in the sand.
That's a good summary. Conversely, actions are not usually considered bad faith if they are part of a legitimate business strategy, for example, integrating the acquired company in a way that generates long-term synergies for the buyer, even if it temporarily impacts the earnout metrics. Similarly, if the buyer actually made substantial efforts to support the target business, like investing in new initiatives or hiring additional personnel, those actions would weigh against a finding of bad faith. It's about differentiating between a reasonable business decision that might incidentally affect an earnout versus an action whose primary purpose seems to be preventing it.
And you mentioned other U.S. states might have different views.
Right. It's worth briefly noting that some other influential U.S. states, like maybe California or Massachusetts, sometimes do imply a reasonable effort obligation on buyers, even without explicit clauses in the contract. That's a significant difference from Delaware's more restrictive contract-first approach. So jurisdiction matters.
This brings us to a fascinating point. How do these two key legal perspectives, Korea's Civil Code Article 150 and Delaware's implied covenant, really connect or differ, especially when it comes to the trickiness of proving bad faith intent? They both grapple with bad faith, but maybe from slightly different angles.
Well, one key difference is that Korean Civil Code Article 150 is a direct statutory rule. It's right there in the code. It's not merely a supplementary gap filler created by judges through case law, like Delaware's implied covenant primarily is.
What does that mean in practice?
It means its application can potentially be broader. It might cover a wider variety of situations without necessarily needing an explicit contractual vacuum or ambiguity. It's an overarching principle of good faith embedded directly in the law itself.
That makes sense. But the challenge of proving intent still seems huge in both jurisdictions, doesn't it? I mean, if a buyer actively reduces revenue or increases costs or changes business plans with the clear intention of preventing the earnout, and you can somehow show causation, that clearly points to bad faith. But proving that specific intent must be incredibly difficult if the buyer can just present some kind of reasonable business purpose for their actions.
It is very difficult.
Yeah.
Intent often has to be inferred from indirect evidence, maybe from a pattern of behavior, which can often feel circumstantial at best, especially when the buyer controls most of the information post-closing.
And this leads us to that key question, particularly relevant back in the Korean context. If the earnout condition depends on a party's effort, and that party the one who would face a financial burden if the condition is met, typically the buyer simply doesn't make the effort. Maybe they just seem to be dragging their feet or not prioritizing it. Does that passive lack of effort constitute bad faith under Civil Code Article 150?
That's the really tricky no-effort nuance. And generally, based on how Korean courts interpret things like the business judgment rule, the answer is probably no, unless an effort obligation is explicitly stipulated in the contract.
So just doing nothing, even if doing something might have helped the earnout, isn't necessarily bad faith without that specific clause?
Generally not. This is because typically the business judgment rule protects management decisions that are made, or appear to be made, in the best interest of the company itself, even if they inadvertently or conveniently lead to the earnout target not being met. A seller's justified expectation or trust usually only extends to the buyer running the business competently and legally, but not necessarily optimizing for the seller's earnout at all costs or exerting specific additional efforts to achieve it unless that was explicitly bargained for and written into the agreement. The default assumption is the buyer will run the company as they see fit for their own overall strategic goals, not primarily for the seller's earnout benefit.
Okay, so even if you can potentially show bad faith actions, there's still another significant hurdle: causation. If bad faith obstruction occurs, does the seller also have to prove that but for the buyer's bad actions, the earnout condition would have been fulfilled? That sounds like a real but for conundrum. I know academic opinions are often divided on this. It seems almost impossible to prove what would have happened in a hypothetical alternative universe where the bad act didn't occur.
They are indeed divided. Some legal scholars argue, yes, you must prove strict but for causation. They'd say otherwise the obstructing party is unfairly penalized. They might be forced to pay an earnout that perhaps wouldn't have been achieved anyway, even without their interference.
Makes sense. But the other side?
Others argue no, stating that demanding such strict proof is often too difficult, especially when the obstructing party controls the information. Requiring strict proof could effectively undermine the very protection Article 150 is meant to provide to the disadvantaged party. It would make the rule almost toothless in practice.
So what's the Korean Supreme Court's stance on this? I know you mentioned a ruling 2022 DI 266645. Does it lean towards requiring strict proof, or does it offer a more flexible approach?
The Supreme Court generally does require causation, meaning the obstruction must have been the reason the condition was not met. However, and this is the critical nuance, they do not demand strict scientific proof of, but for causation.
Okay, that's important. What standard do they use then?
Instead, they require that, according to social norms, if there had been no interfering act, the condition would have been achieved. It's a more practical, common-sense standard. They explicitly state this does not include cases where the likelihood of achievement was already markedly low, even without any interference. So it's really about establishing a substantial probability of achievement, not absolute certainty.
So it's a more flexible standard of proof, which must be a significant relief for sellers who might otherwise face an almost impossible burden. What factors do the courts consider when making this judgment? How do they determine this substantial probability?
The court considers a wide array of factors in a holistic way. They look at the specific circumstances of the contract itself, the party's intent during negotiations, the purpose and content of the conditional legal act, the earn-out, the nature and severity of the interfering act, the inherent likelihood of the condition being met absent the interference, and the actual influence or impact of the interference. They also consider other influencing factors, like external market conditions or unforeseen events that might have affected performance anyway. It's a fact-specific assessment, allowing for practical realities.
Can you give us an illustrative scenario, maybe from an M&A context, that helps clarify this relaxed standard of causation for our listeners? It seems like this is where the theory really hits the practical challenges.
Certainly. Let's adapt an example often used in Korean legal discussions, originally about a civil service exam. If a student is wrongly prevented from taking an exam, how do you prove they would have passed? You can't know for sure. But if their past mock scores consistently showed a substantial probability of passing, that's often deemed sufficient proof of causation, even without absolute certainty.
Okay, applying that logic to M&A.
Right. Applying that to M&A, imagine a scenario where a seller, post-acquisition, was contractually obligated, maybe even incentivized, to continue managing the target company during the earn-out period. The earn-out condition was based on, say, achieving certain revenue growth, and the company was on a strong trajectory under the seller's leadership. However, the buyer, without any rational cause or evidence of wrongdoing by the seller, arbitrarily terminates the seller's management role, maybe pushes them out via a shareholder meeting and takes over direct control. Subsequently, the earn-out condition is not met under the buyer's management.
The challenge here, obviously, is that it's practically impossible to rigorously prove what the company's performance would have been if the seller had remained in charge. It's that parallel universe problem again. So, how would the seller attempt to demonstrate substantial probability in this very difficult situation using the relaxed standard?
The seller could try to build a case by presenting several pieces of evidence. This might include their detailed original business plans and financial projections for the earn-out period, importantly, prepared before the acquisition or the interference. Solid evidence of their impressive track record and historical performance leading up to the acquisition, and maybe a meticulous comparative analysis.
Comparing what?
Comparing the company's actual performance after their removal with their original projections, specifically highlighting the negative impact of the management change, or pointing to specific detrimental decisions made by the buyer's new management team that deviated from the plan. If this collective evidence convincingly demonstrates a substantial probability that the earn-out would have been achieved under their continued management, then causation could be considered proven under this relaxed standard.
Okay. And then the burden shifts to the buyer, presumably. It's not just game over for the buyer if the seller shows substantial probability.
Exactly. The burden then shifts to the buyer to prove counter-causation. They would need to demonstrate that even if the seller had remained in management, the conditions still would not have been met due to other special circumstances, completely unrelated to the buyer's actions.
Like what kind of special circumstances?
For instance, the buyer might argue there was an unforeseen global pandemic that completely crushed market demand in that sector, or a sudden major industry downturn affecting all players. Or maybe a disruptive new competitor emerged that fundamentally altered the business landscape, making the original projections irrelevant. The court would then have to weigh the evidence from both sides to determine which causal chain the seller's probability argument or the buyer's counter-causation argument is superior or more compelling based on the facts.
So the key conclusion on causation is that it is necessary, but the standard of proof, in Korea at least, is flexible and adapts to the specific circumstances. It's about establishing that substantial probability, not an absolute certainty. This seems like a critical nuance for anyone involved in earn-out disputes, offering a potential path for sellers while still requiring legitimate justification and evidence from buyers. Given all these complexities, the incentive issues, the bad faith interpretations, the causation hurdles, it becomes incredibly clear that the initial drafting of these earn-out clauses is just paramount. So let's talk specifically about the power of including effort obligations in that drafting process. Do these clauses, like best effort or commercially reasonable effort, actually have legal standing? Can you rely on them in the US and Korea, or are they just sort of aspirational language?
Generally, yes, they can have legal standing, particularly if they are drafted with sufficient specificity. In the US and the UK, effort clauses can be legally binding. Commercially reasonable effort is probably the most common standard you see in U.S. earnouts because it implies a balancing act considering the goal alongside other legitimate business factors.
Is there a big difference between best effort and reasonable effort?
The distinction can be nuanced, and it varies. For example, UK courts sometimes see best effort as requiring a party to take all reasonable steps available to achieve the goal, almost like a fiduciary duty, whereas reasonable effort might only require taking some sensible and proportionate steps. But the key point across both jurisdictions is their potential enforceability, if they are clearly defined within the context of the specific deal and obligations.
Okay, and what about the Korean Supreme Court's view on effort clauses? I know you mentioned it's been evolving, as historically it seemed quite difficult to enforce these as truly binding obligations in Korea.
That's right. Historically, the Korean Supreme Court tended to view phrases like make best efforts or do utmost as potentially non-binding factual commitments, almost like a strong promise or a statement of intent, but not necessarily a hard legal obligation unless special circumstances existed. They are often seen as too vague to enforce directly for damages.
But that's changing.
Yes, a more recent landmark decision, that 2021 D223054 case we discussed earlier, has provided more clarity on what these special circumstances might entail, signaling a definite shift. The court indicated it will now consider the entire contract, the negotiation history, the party's true intent and purpose when including the clause, and the actual feasibility of the obligation. In that specific case, which involved an obligation to maintain equity ratio, the court did find a legally binding effort obligation based on the specific context and the clear intent of the parties.
So the nuance here seems to be that while a very generic make best efforts clause thrown in might still struggle to be binding on its own in Korea, careful drafting, clear context, and demonstrating specific intent can absolutely give these clauses real legal force. That's a significant development for dealmakers relying on Korean law.
It is a significant development.
Yes.
And this leads us to another critical distinction that needs careful attention during drafting: the difference between active versus passive effort obligations. The Merritt Quorum v. Mitchell International Inc. case from 2020, decided by the Delaware Supreme Court, is a prime example of this distinction and offers a really crucial lesson for drafters.
Okay, what was the background there, and what was the specific language in the earn-out clause that was being disputed?
In that case, the earn-out clause stated the buyer will cause the target company to act in good faith and in a commercially reasonable manner to avoid taking actions that would reasonably be expected to materially reduce the contingent payment amounts. So the focus was on avoiding harmful actions.
Okay, and the earn-out wasn't met. The seller presumably argued the buyer didn't do enough.
Right. The seller claimed the buyer violated this by failing to actively increase revenue, arguing they should have done more proactive things to hit the targets.
And what was the court's ruling? Did they agree that the buyer had violated their obligation by not actively driving revenue upwards?
No, the court did not find a violation. The court drew a very sharp distinction. They differentiated between avoiding actions, which they interpreted as a passive negative obligation, essentially meaning don't do bad things that hurt their earnout, and avoiding inaction, which would imply an active positive obligation, meaning you must do good things to actively increase the earnout.
So because the clause only talked about avoiding negative actions?
Exactly. Because the clause only specified the former, avoiding bad actions, and evidence showed that an active effort obligation had actually been specifically negotiated out of the agreement, the court refused to imply an obligation for the buyer to actively increase revenue. The buyer's only duty under that specific language was simply not to actively interfere negatively.
Wow. That is a critical lesson for drafters and especially sellers. If you want the buyer to actively work towards hitting the earnout conditions, you absolutely must explicitly state that positive effort obligation. A simple no bad faith actions clause or even avoid taking actions to reduce might not be enough to compel proactive steps. It acts like a defensive shield for the seller, not an offensive weapon to force action.
That's a great way to put it. It's a shield, not a sword. But sometimes, even with broad discretion granted to the buyer, specific positive effort obligations can be enforced if they are clearly written and measurable. The FMLS v. Integris Bioservices case from 2023, also from Delaware's Court of Chancery, illustrates this counterbalance. This case is important because it shows the limits of general buyer discretion when specific positive duties are also enumerated in the contract.
Okay, what was the situation in FMLS v. Integris Bioservices? It sounds like the buyer had some broad discretion, but also some specific duties laid out.
It involved an earnout for a biotech services company. The contract included 3 key and potentially somewhat conflicting points. First, it stated the buyer had sole discretion in operations post-closing. Okay, broad power. But second, it explicitly prohibited bad faith actions or omissions designed to reduce the earnout. And third, crucially, it included a specific commercially reasonable efforts obligation for the buyer to ensure adequate funding, personnel, and support for the target business, consistent with how the seller had run it pre-closing.
Okay, so a mix of discretion and specific obligations. What happened?
The earnout wasn't met, but very suspiciously, the revenues for the acquired business apparently soared immediately after the earnout period ended.
That timing again. Extremely suspicious. What was the ruling, and what specific actions or inactions did the court focus on to find a violation?
The court did find a violation of the effort obligation regarding personnel. The evidence showed the buyer had significantly delayed hiring needed scientists, taking 2 months just to prepare a hiring team, and then another 4 months with virtually no actual hires made, despite knowing scientists had left pre-closing, and despite promises of external recruitment. They also, rather inexplicably, rejected recruitment firms introduced by the seller who had a strong track record in that niche.
So the failure was specific and measurable, not hiring people they needed. Exactly. The court concluded these specific actions and omissions constituted a failure to meet the explicit, commercially reasonable efforts obligation regarding ensuring adequate personnel. Furthermore, the court inferred a bad faith intent to prevent the earnout, particularly given that sudden dramatic revenue spike immediately after the earnout period concluded. It strongly suggested the buyer might have strategically delayed projects or stockpiled business until after the measurement period.
That's another powerful takeaway. Even with a broad discretion clause lurking in the contract, a specific positive effort obligation, like ensuring adequate personnel or maintaining a certain level of R&D investment, can potentially be enforced, particularly when the buyer's actions, or inactions, are demonstrably detrimental and seem to align with an inferred intent to avoid payment. It's about focusing on specific measurable actions or omissions, not just vague allegations of not trying hard enough.
Absolutely.
Now, let's tie all this back to interpreting effort obligations, specifically in Korean earnouts, and how they really link to that concept of good faith under Civil Code Article 150. You mentioned Korean law is moving towards recognizing effort clauses as potentially binding, but it still sounds like directly enforcing an earnout effort clause as an independent, legally binding obligation, say, suing for damages based solely on lack of effort, might still be difficult in practice.
That's generally true. It's often difficult, partly due to the inherent vagueness of defining effort in monetary terms, and the immense challenge of quantifying the damages, that is, proving exactly what would have happened financially if the required effort had been made. How do you put a precise number on that hypothetical scenario is very tough.
So direct enforcement for damages based purely on lack of effort is tough. How does an effort obligation actually hold weight in Korea? It sounds like it's not a direct path to a lawsuit for breach of contract in the same way missing a specific financial target might be.
Exactly. Instead, the most effective way to interpret and leverage effort obligations in Korea is by connecting them directly to Civil Code Article 150 and that crucial concept we discussed, justified trust. Shinui-son again. This is really where the practical power lies for sellers who negotiate these clauses.
Okay, walk us through that connection. What if there's no explicit effort clause in a Korean earnout agreement? How does the justified trust concept play out then?
If there's no explicit effort clause, as we touched on, the buyer's post-acquisition management is largely governed by the business judgment rule. This gives the buyer wide latitude to make decisions they genuinely believe are in the company's best interest. In that situation, it's very difficult for a seller to argue bad faith under Article 150 if the buyer's actions are deemed to be reasonable business decisions, even if they inadvertently or perhaps conveniently lead to the earnout not being met. The seller's justified trust in that scenario usually only extends to the buyer running the business competently and legally, not necessarily optimizing specifically for the seller's earnout benefit.
Okay, but adding an effort clause fundamentally changes the nature of that relationship and the seller's expectations. It creates a new specific basis for that justified trust. That sounds like a really powerful shift in the dynamic.
Precisely. When parties do explicitly include an effort obligation in an earnout clause, say, use commercially reasonable efforts to achieve the earnout targets, they are fundamentally creating a new, explicit basis for justified trust for the seller. The seller now reasonably expects the buyer to make that specified effort towards the earnout, It becomes a contractual promise, a specific expectation that the seller can now legally rely upon.
Let's use a scenario to illustrate this critical point, because this is where the theory becomes really practical for dealmakers drafting these agreements under Korean law. Imagine the acquired company, now run by the buyer, has two major strategic options on the table, option A and option B. Let's say both options would have a roughly similar net present value for the company overall, meaning they're arguably equivalent in terms of long-term financial benefit to the buyer as the new owner. However, option A, if chosen, would clearly lead to the earnout condition being met within the required time frame, while option B would not, perhaps due to its different revenue recognition schedule or upfront cost structure.
Right. In a scenario without an explicit effort clause, the buyer's choice of option B would likely be protected by the business judgment rule. It would be very challenging for the seller to claim bad faith under Article 150 because the buyer could simply argue it was a legitimate business decision, yielding a similar overall long-term value for the company, even if it unfortunately meant the short-term earnout was missed. There's no contractual obligation to prioritize the earnout in that tiebreak situation.
But with an effort clause, let's say a clause requiring commercially reasonable efforts to achieve the earnout conditions, or maybe to operate the business in a manner reasonably designed to achieve the earnout, situation changes dramatically.
It really does. If the buyer was aware of the situation, aware that both options yield similar overall value for the company, but only option A directly leads to the earnout payment, the seller could then reasonably expect the buyer, under the effort clause, to make reasonable efforts to choose option A, given that it doesn't actually harm the company's overall best interest.
So if the buyer deliberately chooses option B anyway...
If the buyer then deliberately chooses option B, knowing it will cause the earnout to be missed, this failure to make the expected effort, the effort promised in the contract, could then be interpreted as acting in bad faith against the seller's justified trust under Civil Code Article 150. The effort clause provides the concrete basis, the specific contractual grounding for the seller's expectation and the finding of bad faith.
So just to be clear, the effort clause doesn't automatically mean the buyer has to hit the earnout target or that they have to incur losses for the company just to make the seller whole?
No, absolutely not. It's crucial to clarify what effort does not imply. It does not mean the buyer must incur losses for the company or undertake entirely new, risky business activities that weren't previously envisioned or agreed upon just to chase an earnout. It primarily creates a duty to consider the earnout and potentially favor earnout-conducive decisions when the company's overall best interest is otherwise neutral or roughly equivalent, especially for financially material decisions that directly impact the agreed-upon metrics. It's about how discretion is exercised within the agreed parameters, now including the earnout as a factor.
Therefore, the really practical takeaway for drafting under Korean law is this. While effort clauses might not always provide a straightforward path to direct legal remedies for non-performance, like simple damages for lack of effort, they significantly increase the likelihood of successfully invoking Civil Code Article 150 if things go wrong. They do this by establishing a clear contractual basis for the seller's justified trust, making the buyer's subsequent inaction or adverse action potentially constitute a breach of good faith. It transforms what might be just a vague hope into a concrete, legally relevant expectation.
Exactly. It gives Article 150 much more teeth in the earnout context.
So we've really navigated the complex, sometimes treacherous world of M&A earnout clauses today. We've gone from their essential role in bridging those tricky valuation gaps right through to the myriad disputes they can unfortunately spark. We've seen how legal interpretations, particularly in Korea and Delaware, grapple with these core concepts of good faith, causation, and the enforceability of effort obligations, highlighting both their similarities and some crucial differences in approach.
Yeah, what stands out time and again is that earnouts, despite their undeniable utility in getting deals done, are truly a double-edged sword. Their power, their effectiveness, lies not just in their mere existence, but really in the meticulous art, the careful craft of your drafting.
Precision seems key.
Absolutely. Precision in defining the conditions, setting clear boundaries for management discretion post-closing, and including well-considered specific effort obligations. These things can make all the difference between a successful, value-aligned transaction where everyone feels like they won, and a costly, drawn-out, relationship-destroying legal battle. It's really about anticipating those potential future conflicts during the negotiation and drafting phase and trying to write them out of existence before they even have a chance to arise.
It really emphasizes that lawyers and deal makers need to think beyond just the headline numbers and the closing date. You have to delve into the operational nuances, the potential shifts in incentives, the disincentives these clauses create down the line. And, as the speed of change in business and technology just continues to accelerate and predicting the future value of companies becomes arguably even harder, it raises a provocative thought for all of us listening. How might we see earnout clauses evolve in the coming years?
That's a fascinating question to ponder. What new kinds of conditions or perhaps different types of effort obligations might dealmakers need to invent to truly align interests in the future? Maybe moving beyond purely financial metrics. Well, perhaps incorporating elements like hitting key technological milestones, achieving successful product launches in new markets, maybe even meeting specific ESG and environmental social governance targets, or demonstrating certain market adoption rates for a new technology. How do you measure the value created by a breakthrough R&D success if it doesn't immediately translate into revenue or profit within a typical 1 or 2 year earnout period?
That's a real challenge. And how can we, as advisors and principals, proactively anticipate and draft for these emerging complexities in today's deals? So we're not always reacting to disputes based on old models, but actually preventing them by designing structures that make these win-win mechanisms truly work as intended in a faster-moving world. That's definitely something to mull over as you navigate your next M&A journey.